No, I'm going to refer to this particular First Nation by its initials because if I attempt to pronounce it, I will embarrass me and enrage anyone who hears it. So the colloquial name, it's either the Big Trout First Nation or KI, which is the abbreviation of its indigenous name. It's a reserve, a First Nation, about 600 kilometers north of Thunder Bay. So it's pretty isolated, probably pretty typical of northern isolated remote reserves. And last Thursday morning, just before dawn, there was a horrible house fire. And in the house fire, 5 people lost their lives. Foster mom named Geraldine Chapman, and her own daughter, Shyra, Shadara, Taylor, Bella, and 3 of the children for whom she was the long-term foster parent. Everyone in the community, including the families of the foster children, recognized that she was the mom, though of course all the other families have been affected too. The other children's names were Angel Kenisha McKay, Karl, Jovon, Cutfeet, and Hailey Jenna Chapman. They were respectively 6, 12, 9, and 7 years old. The next day I read a story by the Canadian Press in which spokesman Sam McKay, he's a spokesman for the chief there, and he was describing, I guess he was describing what had happened, but in part he was describing the sort of fatalistic attitude that many Indigenous people have, I think, about fire on these isolated reserves. And he said, you know, we have a fire truck that doesn't work, we have no hoses, and we have no fire hall. So when fire breaks out, he told the CP reporter, basically what we do around here is we stand and watch the building burn and make sure no one's inside. This time we were not so lucky. And like so many other issues, you know, water, housing standards, the whole bloody picture. The situation for fire safety on many reserves, not all of them of course, but many, is absolutely odious and desperate. It's a classic illustration of the bureaucratic death spiral that exists with First Nations in this country, because the federal government has jurisdiction, as it always seems to. The provinces have some role to play, but never a major role. And of course, the First Nation government has a role. And quite frankly, I think all of them have some responsibility to bear in this. I mean, how do you have entire communities living in decrepit, often moldy, overcrowded housing, where people often have to use diesel generators or wood stoves to heat, and add to that, with no smoke alarms, with none of the protections that we take for granted in the rest of Canada. So all those governments, including the Aboriginal one, bear some responsibility. I mean, smoke alarms aren't magic new technology. All First Nations get a lot of money from the federal government, including this one. Why didn't the Aboriginal Council make sure that every house on the reserve has smoke detectors that work? Why don't they spend some of the money they get to make sure the fire truck works? I remember being on a reservation in the southern prairies. This wasn't an isolated case at all. This was really close to a major urban area a couple of years ago, maybe 7 years ago now. I was there because there'd been another kind of tragedy. But in the course of covering that, I saw a fire truck which had rusted out because it had, you know, they bought a fire truck and it had rusted out. They had no volunteer fire department. Everywhere else in this country, little boys particularly aspire to be firemen and aspire to be volunteer firemen if there isn't a real fire department. But that doesn't happen on all First Nations. So I'm not exculpating anybody. I think everybody's to blame in this. But you know who isn't to blame? An entire generation of innocent First Nations kids who are essentially sitting ducks every night they go to bed on some of these First Nations. And that is unacceptable and it needs to be fixed now.